In the vast, labyrinthine archives of the British War Office and the American Pentagon, there are files that remain sealed for reasons of national security, blueprints for nuclear triggers, identities of deep cover operatives, and strategies for wars yet to be fought. But there is another category of secret, one that gathers dust not because it contains dangerous truths, but because it contains unbearable embarrassments. For 60 years, the file on Operation Spectre, a pseudonym for the mission, as the real operational name remains a point of contention among historians, remained buried under the highest classification. It was not redacted to protect the innocent. It was redacted to protect the reputations of men who should have known better. The story begins in the chill of early 1943. The tide of the Second World War was just beginning to turn. The Allies had secured a foothold in North Africa, the German Sixth Army had crumbled at Stalingrad, and the soft underbelly of Europe was being eyed with hungry intent. But before the massive invasions of Sicily or Italy could be launched, the Mediterranean theater was plagued by 1,000 tiny pinpricks, small islands, secluded coves, and rocky promontories where the Axis powers maintained eyes and ears. This is the story of one such pinprick. The paper reality. The target was a minor harbor on a rocky, scrub-covered island, largely forgotten by the cartographers of the pre-war era. Intelligence reports, typed on onion skin paper and stamped with the confident authority of headquarters, described the location as a tertiary logistical node. According to the reconnaissance photographs, taken from high altitude by a jittery pilot dodging cloud cover, the harbor was home to nothing more than a dilapidated fishing pier, a trio of stone warehouses, and a single, lonely structure identified as a light Axis observation post. Major generals sat in smoke-filled rooms in Algiers, tapping rulers against large-scale maps. To them, the logic was irrefutable. If the Allies were to move shipping convoys through this sector, that observation post had to go. It was a matter of operational hygiene. It's a milk run, one briefing officer reportedly told the assemblage of unit commanders. You go in, you knock out the radio mast, you secure the warehouses, and you're back on the boats for tea. 2 hours, maximum. The confidence was infectious. It was also born of ignorance. The intelligence assessment had been filed by an analyst who had never set foot in the Mediterranean, based on photos that were 3 weeks old. The report listed the enemy strength as negligible. It estimated a garrison of perhaps 20 men, likely older reservists or conscripts relegated to guarding seagulls. There was no mention of the shifting tides. There was no mention of the magnetic anomalies in the local rock that played havoc with compasses. And, most critically, there was no mention that the light observation post had been reinforced 3 days prior. The force, the unit assembled for this routine task, was a composite force, a patchwork quilt of Allied cooperation that looked good on paper but was fraught with friction in reality. It consisted of 2 companies, one American, fresh-faced and eager to their mettle after arriving late to the North African party, and one British, composed of commandos who had seen too much action and viewed their American counterparts as loud and undisciplined. The operation was designed to be a showcase of Allied unity. Instead, it was a case study in bureaucratic schizophrenia. Because the mission was deemed too small for a general but too complex for a captain, command was split. In a decision that defies military logic but perfectly illustrates the political maneuvering of coalition warfare, 2 senior officers were attached to the landing force. Lieutenant Colonel H.K. Bull Miller was the American commander, a man who believed in speed, aggression, and volume. Major Alistair Sterling was the British counterpart, a man who believed in stealth, precision, and maps. Technically, Miller was the ranking officer by grade. However, the operational charter stated that tactical decisions regarding the landing phase were under the purview of the British Naval Command, represented by Sterling's detachment. The orders were vaguely worded, likely a compromise hammered out over drinks in a faraway officers' club. They were 2 captains for 1 ship, and as the landing craft cut their engines and began their silent drift toward the dark coastline, neither man realized that they were effectively steering the mission into a catastrophic spin. The black water. The night of the landing was moonless, the Mediterranean Sea heaving with a sullen, oily swell. Inside the landing craft assault LCA boats, the smell was a potent cocktail of diesel fumes, wet wool, stale tobacco, and vomit. The plan relied on precision. The flotilla was to approach the harbor from the south, using a distinct rock formation known as the Monk's Head as a guide. They would hit the sandy shoal at 0400 hours, exactly 1 hour before dawn, giving them enough darkness to secure the beachhead and enough coming light to assault the observation post. But the sea has no respect for timetables. At 0345, a heavy mist rolled off the water, obscuring the coastline. The coxswain of the lead boat, straining his eyes against the gloom, was fighting a current that was 3 knots stronger than the charts predicted. The Monk's Head was nowhere to be seen. In the darkness, every jagged rock looked like a monk, and every shadow looked like a harbor mouth. Hesitation is the enemy of amphibious landings. Anxious to keep to the timeline, and fearing a reprimand more than a navigation error, the lead navigator made a call. He spotted a dark mass on the horizon that roughly approximated the target profile. "That's it," he signaled. "Bearing 310. Go in." It wasn't it. The current had dragged the entire invasion force 3 kilometers to the east. Instead of a sandy shoal leading to a gentle slope, they were heading directly for a jagged stretch of coastline known to the locals as the Devil's Teeth. The crunch. The first sign of trouble was the sound. A sandy landing sounds like a heavy sigh, the hull sliding over grit. This landing sounded like a car crash. Crunch, screech. The boats slammed into submerged reefs 50 yards offshore. Men who had been braced for a slide were thrown forward into bulkheads. Helmets clattered. Rifles banged against steel. Then, the ramps dropped. Instead of knee-deep water, the first wave of troops stepped off the ramps into a 6-foot drop into a swirling, freezing depression in the seafloor. Men flailed in the darkness, weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, gasping as the cold saltwater filled their boots and pockets. Panic rippled through the line. "Move! Move! Get off the ramp!" Sergeants screamed, unaware that they were sending their men into a drowning pool. It took 20 minutes of chaotic struggle just to get the force onto dry land. By the time they dragged themselves onto the beach, shivering, coughing up seawater, and soaked to the bone, the timeline was already shattered. The silence and the noise. Lieutenant Colonel Miller scrambled up the shale, his boots sliding on the slick rocks. He grabbed his radioman by the shoulder harness. "Get command," Miller barked, spitting out salt water. "Tell them we've hit the beach. Tell them the terrain is wrong." The young radioman, shivering violently, unslung the heavy SCR 300 radio set. He dialed in the frequency. He keyed the mic. Nothing. Just the hollow hiss of dead air. "Check the connections, sir. It's wet inside, sir." The waterproof casing had cracked during the impact with the reef, or perhaps during the submersion. Saltwater, highly conductive and corrosive, had shorted the vacuum tubes. Miller cursed. "Try the backup." "The backup was on Boat 4, sir. Boat 4 is stuck on the reef." Meanwhile, 50 yards down the beach, Major Sterling was having the exact same conversation with his signaller. The British Type 18 set had fared no better. The force was blind. They were deaf. They were 3 kilometers off target, though they didn't know it yet. The split. This was the moment, the crucial pivot point, where a unified command could have saved the operation. A single voice needed to say, "Stop. Reorient. Wait for dawn." Instead, 2 voices spoke at once. Miller, looking at the steep cliffs looming above them, saw a narrow goat track winding up to the left. His aggressive instinct kicked in. "The harbor must be just over that ridge," he concluded. "We flank them from the high ground. Charlie Company, follow me. We go left." Major Sterling, consulting his water-damaged map under a red lens flashlight, came to a different conclusion. He saw a depression in the coastline to the right. "We've landed too far west," he muttered to his sergeant. "The harbor is to the east. We need to follow the shoreline. Bravo Company, with me. We go right." In the chaos of the dark, wind-swept beach, the orders crossed. "Move out. Go left," yelled the American NCOs. "Form up. Move right," shouted the British sergeants. The troops, wet, miserable, and disoriented, simply followed the loudest voice closest to them. The force didn't just split, it fractured. Squads were mixed. An American machine gun team found themselves following the British major. A British mortar section trudged up the goat path behind the American colonel. Within 10 minutes, the Allied force was marching away from each other, heading in opposite directions into the unknown dark. They believed they were enveloping the enemy. In reality, they were setting the stage for a tragic comedy of errors. They were marching not toward the enemy, but toward a phantom threat, leaving their backs exposed to the very real garrison that was currently sleeping soundly 3 kilometers away, completely unaware that an invasion had even occurred. The sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. And as the light grew, it would reveal not a simple harbor, but a battlefield prepared for a disaster that no one had written in the script. As the 2 fractured columns of the Allied force pushed inland, the adrenaline of the disastrous landing began to fade, replaced by a gnawing, cold misery. They were leaving the sound of the surf behind, marching into a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent architect specifically to frustrate infantry movement. The island was not the soft, sandy paradise depicted in travel brochures of the era. It was a geological boneyard. The ground was a tortured mix of limestone karst, sharp, brittle rock that sliced through boot leather, and dense, waist-high scrub known as maquis. This vegetation was tough, aromatic, and covered in thorns that snagged uniforms and scratched exposed skin raw. For the men of Lieutenant Colonel Miller's American detachment, now climbing the Goat Path to the west, the terrain was a nightmare. The path, which had looked like a viable route from the beach, quickly dissolved into a series of disjointed animal trails. They were hauling heavy equipment, mortars, base plates, crates of .30 caliber ammunition, up a gradient that averaged 30 degrees. Every step was a gamble. Loose shale clattered loudly underfoot, the sound amplified by the canyon walls, sounding to the nervous soldiers like gunshots. "Keep it quiet," Miller hissed repeatedly, his face flushed with exertion. "We are ghosting in." But they weren't ghosting. They were stumbling. They were a herd of elephants trying to sneak through a pottery shop. The men were soaked from the waist down, their wool trousers heavy and chafing. Saltwater dried into a crust on their skin, itching maddeningly. To the east, Major Sterling's British contingent was faring no better. They had entered a low-lying area that the map, now a sodden pulp in Sterling's pocket, had promised was a meadow. In reality, it was a salt marsh, a bog of sucking mud hidden beneath a deceptive layer of dry reeds. Every third step, a boot would vanish into the muck with a wet slurp, requiring a comrade to help pull the trapped soldier free. The discipline of the commandos, usually ironclad, was fraying. "If this is the meadow," one corporal muttered, scraping mud off his Sten gun, "I'd hate to see the bloody swamp." The fog of silence. Compounding the physical misery was the psychological weight of isolation. In modern warfare, information is oxygen. Without it, a unit begins to suffocate. The radios remained dead. The signal corps operators walked with the handsets pressed to their ears, desperate for a crackle of static, a voice, anything. But the silence was absolute. The saltwater corruption had done its work thoroughly. This lack of communication bred a specific kind of paranoia. Without a central command to orient them, each group began to create its own reality. Colonel Miller, aggressive and eager, convinced himself that the silence from the British meant Sterling had already engaged the enemy. "They're probably fighting for their lives right now," he told his executive officer. "We have to flank the target fast to take the pressure off." Major Sterling, cautious and cynical, assumed the silence meant the Americans were lost or dragging their feet. "Cowboys are probably having a smoke break," he whispered to his sergeant major. "We need to press on and secure the objective before they wake up the whole island." Both assumptions were wrong. Both assumptions drove the men faster, making them more careless, pushing them deeper into the confusion. The convergence. By 0530, the false dawn began to bleach the sky, that gray, indistinct light that plays tricks on the human eye. Shadows stretched and warped. A bush became a crouching sniper, a rock formation became a bunker. Unbeknownst to either commander, the geography of the island was funneling them together. The Goat Path Miller followed and the marsh Sterling traversed both terminated at the edge of a geological scar, a dry, ancient riverbed known to the locals as the Wadi of the Dead. It was a depression about 50 yards wide, filled with tumbled boulders and flanked by high banks of erosion. It was the perfect defensive position. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. The American force approached the Wadi from the high western bank. They were looking down into the depression, silhouettes against the lightening sky. The British force approached from the low eastern bank, emerging from the reed beds. They were looking up, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. Both groups were on edge. They had been told there were enemy patrols. They had been told the observation post was guarded. Every nerve ending was singing with the anticipation of violence. A young American private, a boy from Ohio named Skeeter, carrying a heavy Browning automatic rifle, was on point for Miller's group. He paused at the lip of the wadi, peering into the gloom. He saw movement in the rocks below. A British commando, a hardened veteran of the Norway campaign, was on point for Stirling. He looked up at the ridge. He saw a helmet silhouette against the sky. The shape of the helmet was indistinct. The movement in the rocks was jerky. In the high-stakes calculus of war, hesitation gets you killed. Identification takes seconds. Pulling a trigger takes milliseconds. Skeeter tightened his grip on the BAR. The commando raised his Thompson. The world held its breath. It is still debated who fired first. The official report, written weeks later in a tone of bureaucratic exhaustion, simply states, contact was initiated simultaneously due to mutual misidentification. In layman's terms, everyone panicked. A rock slid loose under an American boot. The sound cracked through the ravine. Contact. Front. A voice screamed. It could have been an American accent. It could have been British. In the adrenaline-soaked moment, it didn't matter. Skeeter squeezed the trigger. The bar roared, a heavy, chugging thump-thump-thump that morning silence. Tracers zipped into the darkness of the wadi, sparking off the granite boulders. Below, the British instinct kicked in. They didn't wait to ask questions. They saw muzzle flashes from the ridge, and they returned fire instantly. A dozen Sten guns and Bren light machine guns opened up, spraying the canyon rim with 9mm and .303 rounds. 11-minute war. What followed was 11 minutes of intense, deafening, and utterly pointless violence. It was a mad minute, stretched into an eternity. The ravine filled with the acrid, gray smoke of cordite. The noise was thunderous, bouncing off the rock walls and amplifying the perceived size of the enemy force. To the Americans on the ridge, it felt like they had stumbled upon the entire German garrison. They're in the rocks. Dig in. Pour it on. Colonel Miller bellowed, firing his service pistol wildly into the gloom. He was convinced he was suppressing a heavily fortified bunker complex. To the British in the creek bed, it felt like they were being ambushed by a superior force holding the high ground. Suppressing fire. Smoke out. Flank left. Major Stirling commanded. Grenades were thrown. They tumbled down the slopes and exploded with dull whumps, throwing geysers of dirt and scrub into the air. Machine gunners burned through belts of ammunition, barrels glowing cherry red in the dim light. The tragedy of the situation was masked by the sheer incompetence of the engagement. Because it was dark, because they were terrified, and because they were shooting at shadows and muzzle flashes rather than distinct targets, the accuracy was abysmal. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were expended. Rocks were pulverized. Bushes were shredded. The air was thick with lead. But the soldiers were doing exactly what they had been trained to do in an ambush: get low and fire fast. The Americans were prone behind the ridge line, bullets buzzing harmlessly over their heads. The British were tucked behind the massive boulders of the wadi, the granite absorbing the American fire. It was a spectacle of sound and fury, signifying nothing but panic. The boots. The turning point came not from a tactical maneuver, but from a sartorial detail. Sergeant Big Mac McCaffrey, a platoon sergeant in the American company, was trying to direct mortar fire. He had crawled forward to the very edge of the lip to get a better angle on the enemy positions below. The sun had finally crested the horizon proper. A shaft of golden morning light cut through the dissipating smoke, illuminating the floor of the wadi. McCaffrey squinted through his binoculars, looking for a gray German helmet or a field gray tunic. Instead, he saw a boot. It was sticking out from behind a rock, frantically trying to find purchase in the gravel. McCaffrey froze. He knew German boots. They were high, black leather jackboots, often studded with hobnails. The boot he was looking at was brown. It was short, and crucial, it was wrapped in a webbed ankle gaiter, the standard issue anklet of the British Army. McCaffrey shifted his gaze. He saw a sleeve. It wasn't the sharp field gray of the Wehrmacht. It was the distinct, drab khaki wool of the British battle dress uniform. A cold pit opened in McCaffrey's stomach that had nothing to do with the war. "Cease fire," he screamed. His voice was lost in the roar of a nearby machine gun. McCaffrey scrambled over to the gunner and kicked him hard in the leg. "I said cease fire, you moron. Look at their feet." The silence of recognition. The order rippled down the American line. "Cease fire." Check targets. One by one, the American guns fell silent. Down in the wadi, the British sensed the lull. Major Sterling, assuming the enemy was reloading or preparing to charge, raised his hand. Hold fire. Watch for the rush. The shooting stopped. The echoes rattled away down the canyon, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow louder than the battle. The dust began to settle. Who's out there? Colonel Miller yelled from the ridge, his voice cracking with tension. There was a pause. A long, agonizing pause. From behind a boulder in the creek bed, a voice floated up. It was unmistakably, undeniably British. It was a voice dripping with upper-class indignation. "We are the King's Own, you absolute pillocks. Who the bloody hell are you?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of 300 men simultaneously realizing they had just spent 11 minutes trying to kill their allies. The walk of shame. Slowly, tentatively, heads began to poke up from behind rocks. There were no German panzers. There were no fortified bunkers. Just two groups of tired, dirty, wet Allied soldiers staring at each other across 50 yards of rock. The tension broke, replaced instantly by a wave of profound embarrassment. Soldiers stood up, dusting off their knees, checking their bodies for holes that weren't there. Miraculously, despite the volume of fire, the injuries were trivial. A ricochet had grazed a British corporal's helmet, leaving a ringing headache. An American private had sprained his ankle diving for cover. One unlucky radio operator had taken a bullet through his canteen. But the pride total casualty. Colonel Miller slid down the embankment to meet Major Sterling in the center of the wadi. The two commanders stood face to face. The air between them was thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and unsaid expletives. Miller holstered his pistol. Sterling lowered his Sten gun. "Major." Miller nodded, his face a mask of stoic humiliation. "Colonel," Sterling replied, stiffly. There was nothing to say. No tactical debriefing could gloss over the fact that they had just fought a pitched battle against each other while the actual enemy was likely eating breakfast a mile away. "I believe," Sterling said, clearing his throat and adjusting his beret, "that the observation post is that way." He pointed east, away from the Americans. "Right," Miller said. We'll take left flank." As the units reformed and began to move out, giving each other a wide berth and avoiding eye contact, the absurdity of the morning settled over them. They had survived the landing. They had survived the terrain. They had survived each other. Now, they just had to hope the Germans didn't find out. Because if the enemy realized that the Allied invasion force was capable of defeating itself, the war was going to be a very long one indeed. The sun was now fully established in the sky, a harsh, blinding white disk that baked the limestone rocks and turned the humidity of the island into a suffocating blanket. Following the debacle in the wadi, the Allied force had reorganized. The adrenaline of the firefight had burned off, replaced by a grim, silent determination. They had wasted ammunition, they had wasted time, and they had nearly wasted each other. Now, the desire to find the real enemy, to vent their frustration on a legitimate target, was palpable. Colonel Miller and Major Sterling, temporarily united by their shared shame, coordinated the final push. They moved with textbook precision, the kind that would have been useful 3 hours earlier. "Bravo Company takes the ridge line," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. "Charlie Company provides base of fire. We bound forward by squads. If anything moves in that tower, I want it leveled." The objective loomed ahead. The Light Axis observation post. It was an ugly, utilitarian structure of whitewashed concrete and timber, perched on the highest promontory overlooking the harbor. A radio mast stretched into the sky like a skeletal finger. Sandbag emplacements ringed the base. A machine gun nest faced the sea. It looked formidable. It looked like a fortress. The soldiers crept forward, bellies pressed to the hot earth. Every rustle of the wind in the scrub sounded like a bolt cycling. Every shadow looked like a helmet. They were expecting the crack of a sniper rifle or the rip of an MG-42 at any second. But there was only the sound of the cicadas, beginning their midday drone, and the distant lap of the ocean against the cliffs. The enemy's calculation. To understand what happened next, one must step into the boots of the Axis garrison. Intelligence had described them as a light force. In reality, the post was manned by a detachment of 6 Italian coastal reservists and a single German liaison officer, a junior lieutenant named Weber. Weber and his Italians had been awake since 0400. They had heard the distant crunch of the landing craft on the reef, a sound that carried far over the water. They had alerted their HQ, but the radio signal was weak. Then, at dawn, the world had exploded. From their vantage point on the hill, Lieutenant Weber and his men had listened to the battle in the Wadi. They heard the roar of the bars, the chatter of the stens, the thumping of mortars. They heard the shouting, the screaming, the sheer volume of fire. To the ears of Lieutenant Weber, who could not see that the Allies were shooting at each other, the conclusion was terrifyingly simple. Judging by the noise, he estimated he was facing a regiment-sized element. He assumed a massive invasion force was rolling over the island, engaging a phantom defensive line he didn't know existed. Weber did the math. 7 men against a regiment. He looked at his Italian sergeant. The sergeant looked at his bicycle. Tactical withdrawal. Weber decided instantly. Immediate execution. They didn't just leave, they fled. They grabbed their personal weapons, jumped onto a mismatched collection of bicycles and a single sputtering motorcycle, and pedaled frantically toward the far side of the island, hoping to find a fishing boat or simply to hide in the caves until the war was over. They left so fast they forgot to destroy the codebooks. They left so fast they forgot to spike the guns. They left so fast they didn't even turn off the coffee pot. The Phantom Fortress. The Allied assault began at 0615. Go, go, go. Us American GIs surged forward, covering the final 50 yards in a sprint, bayonets fixed. They hurdled the sandbags, screaming war cries meant to terrify the defenders. They landed in the trench line. It was empty. Clear right, clear left. The trenches were devoid of life. There were no bodies, no spent brass, no grim-faced defenders. Just a half-smoked cigarette resting on a rock, a long line of ash still clinging to the tip. Colonel Miller kicked open the front door of the observation post, his Colt .45 raised. Hands up, he was shouting at a table. The room was a snapshot of interrupted life. A pot of ersatz coffee was boiling on a small gas stove, the dark liquid frothing over the rim and hissing as it hit the burner. A game of cards was spread out on the table, Scopa, by the looks of it. A German officer's cap sat on a hook by the door. The radio equipment, the primary target of the entire operation, was humming softly in the corner. The tubes were glowing warm orange. It was fully operational. Major Sterling entered the room a moment later, sweeping the corners with his Sten gun. He lowered the weapon slowly, taking in the scene. He walked over to the stove and turned off the gas. The hissing stopped. The silence that filled the room was heavier than the gunfire had been. "They're gone," Miller said, holstering his pistol. He sounded deflated. "They heard us," Sterling replied, picking up the cards. "They heard us shooting up the Wadi. They must have thought the entire Third Army was coming for them. We scared them off," Miller muttered, trying to find a victory in the situation. "We intimidated them into retreating. We made a lot of noise," Sterling corrected, dryly. "And they decided not to stick around to see which idiots were shooting at each other." Outside, the troops were securing the perimeter. A young private poked his head through the door. "Sir, prisoners secured." Miller and Sterling looked up, hopeful. "You found them?" "No, sir. We found a goat. It was tied up behind the shed. It surrendered immediately." The extraction was executed with a sullen efficiency that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the landing. The mission was technically a complete success. The observation post was neutralized. The radio codes were captured intact, a significant intelligence coup. The harbor was secured, but as the landing craft pulled away from the rocky shore, heading back to the transport ships waiting in deep water, there was no cheering. There were no cigarettes shared in triumph. The men sat on the steel benches, avoiding eye contact. The Americans looked at their boots. The British looked at the horizon. The knowledge of what had happened in the Wadi hung over them like a toxic fog. They all knew the story. The panic, the friendly fire, the 11 minutes of war against their own side, and finally, the assault on an empty room. It wasn't just that mistakes were made. It was that the mistakes were so farcical. It was the kind of story that, if told in a pub, would result in laughter. But in a military context, laughter is dangerous. It undermines authority. It destroys careers. The war room. 2 days later, in a high-ceilinged, map-lined room in Algiers, the debriefing took place. The atmosphere was sterile and cold. A ceiling fan rotated lazily, chopping the thick cigar smoke. A brigadier general sat behind a heavy oak desk, reading the preliminary field report submitted by Colonel Miller and Major Sterling. The general read in silence for a long time. He turned a page. He adjusted his glasses. He turned another page. Finally, he looked up. "Let me get this straight," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You landed on the wrong beach. You lost communications. You split your force. You engaged in a firefight with yourselves for nearly a quarter of an hour. And then you captured a coffee pot. We also captured the codebooks, sir," Miller interjected, sitting at attention. "And the radio equipment. And the facility is denied to the enemy," Sterling added, stiffly. The general took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was a practical man. He cared about results. The result was a win. But the method disaster. "Gentlemen," the general sighed, "we are trying to build a coalition here. We are trying to convince the world that the American and British armies can operate as a seamless, professional machine. This," he tapped the file with a manicured finger. "This reads like a script for a vaudeville comedy." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor. "If the press gets hold of this, we are the laughing stock of the Mediterranean. If Berlin gets hold of this, Goebbels will put it on every radio station in Europe. The Allies are so incompetent they conquer themselves." The stamp of silence. The decision was made not on the battlefield, but at a typewriter. The final after-action report was drafted with the creative ambiguity that is the hallmark of military bureaucracy. The landing error was described as a tactical readjustment due to adverse hydrographic conditions. The loss of radios was termed equipment degradation due to environmental factors. The friendly fire incident, the 11 minutes of terror in the Wadi, was summarized in a single, masterful sentence: advanced elements engaged in confused skirmishing during low-visibility maneuvering prior to the final assault. It didn't lie, but it certainly didn't tell the truth. However, even this sanitized version was deemed too sensitive. The sheer level of incompetence required to produce such a comedy of errors was considered a threat to morale. The file, designated Operation Spectre, R43-9, was placed in a manila folder. A clerk, indifferent to the history he was handling, melted a stick of red sealing wax and dripped it onto the flap. He pressed the official seal into the hot wax. Then, a heavy rubber stamp was brought down. Top secret, not to be released for 60 years. The dust of history. The file was moved to a crate. The crate was moved to a basement in London. Later, copies were moved to a warehouse in Maryland. The war moved on. The men of Operation Spectre went on to fight in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy. Many of them died in real battles, their embarrassment on that Mediterranean island forgotten in the face of true horror. Colonel Miller retired as a brigadier general in the 1950s. Major Sterling went into politics. Neither man ever spoke of the mission again. It became a ghost story, a shared hallucination between the survivors. For 6 decades, the file sat in the dark. It gathered dust. It survived the Cold War. It survived the changing of governments. It sat there, protecting the reputations of men long dead, guarding the secret that on one cool morning in 1943, the Allies had fought a fierce, brave, and completely unnecessary battle against themselves, and won. It wasn't until the declassification orders of the early 2000s that a researcher, looking for data on coastal radar installations, opened the box. He broke the wax seal. He blew off the dust. He began to read. And then, in the quiet of the archives, he began to laugh. It was a story of human error, of the fog of war, and of the absurdity of conflict. It was a reminder that history is not always written in the blood of heroes. Sometimes, it is written in the sweat of embarrassed men running toward the wrong beach.